They told Washington voters they still had a voice. Then the Supreme Court stepped in and said, not this time. Tonight we're talking about a legal ruling that blocks voters from even deciding on Washington's new income tax this November. And while Olympia celebrates, a new business survey shows something else happening beneath the surface, employees looking for the exits. 1 in 4 businesses now says they're considering leaving Washington entirely. In Spokane, 2/3 are eyeing Idaho, and in Seattle, the city's new socialist mayor has a message for wealthy residents thinking about leaving. Bye. Because apparently when taxpayers and employers threaten to walk away from the state economy, the official response now is sarcasm, which is an interesting strategy when your budget model depends on the people you're mocking continuing to write checks forever. Left Coast governance really is just a group project where the loudest kid eats the paste and demands more funding.
From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth.
Welcome back. Tonight, we're looking at a collision between constitutional law, taxation, and economic reality here in Washington state. On one side, lawmakers and activists pushing aggressive new taxation policies under the banner of equity and fair share economics. On the other, businesses, investors, and employers warning that the state is approaching a tipping point. And right in the middle sits a Washington Supreme Court ruling that may fundamentally reshape how voters can challenge controversial laws going forward. Because this wasn't just a technical legal decision, this was about power. Specifically, who gets the final say when lawmakers pass controversial taxes? The voters or Olympia? Let's break it down. The court blocks the referendum. On Monday, the Washington Supreme Court rejected an effort by Let's Go Washington to place the state's new high earner income tax before voters this November. The court ruled that the tax falls under the what's known as the necessity clause in the Washington Constitution. Chief Justice Deborah Steffens wrote, ESSB 6346 falls within the exception for laws that are necessary for the support of the state government and not subject to referendum. That phrase matters, because under Washington law, most legislation can be challenged by referendum. Citizens gather signatures, place the issue on the ballot, and voters decide whether the law stands. But the Constitution contains exceptions. If lawmakers declare a bill necessary for public peace, public health, or public safety, or support of state government, then the law can be shielded from referendum entirely. That's exactly what happened here. So instead of roughly 154,000 signatures for a referendum, opponents now need over 300,000 signatures for a full initiative campaign by July 2nd. That's a massive difference in money, manpower, and logistics. Critics argue the clause was originally intended for genuine emergencies, earthquakes, budget crises, immediate state operations, not politically controversial tax policy. But over time, Olympia discovered something very convenient. If you label enough things necessary, voters stop becoming a problem. Funny how that works. The history of the necessity clause. This isn't the first time Washington lawmakers have used the necessity clause to protect controversial legislation. Not even close. Over the years, the clause has been attached to hundreds of bills, sometimes more than 20% of legislation in a single session. And many of the biggest examples involve taxes, spending, or politically risky projects. The capital gains tax in 2021. The state's capital gains tax also included an emergency clause. Critics pointed out something odd at the time. The tax wouldn't even be collected for nearly 2 years. Sound familiar? So apparently the emergency was so immediate that the government needed urgent protection from voters, but not urgent enough to actually collect the money right away. That raised serious questions about whether the clause was being used for necessity or simply for insulation. The Mariners Stadium funding in 1995. Lawmakers also used the clause during the push to fund what became Safeco Field, now T-Mobile Park. The emergency declaration prevented a referendum that likely would have forced a statewide debate over taxpayer-funded stadium financing, because nothing says constitutional emergency quite like subsidizing professional baseball owners. And the natural gas bill transition. And the National Gas Transition Bill. More recently, lawmakers used the clause on legislation helping transition Puget Sound Energy away from natural gas infrastructure, helping them. Again, opponents argued there was no immediate emergency requiring suspension of referendum rights, but the clause remained intact. The 2005 shift. Historically, Washington courts were more skeptical of these declarations. Earlier courts occasionally struck them down if they believed lawmakers were abusing the process. But that changed in 2005. A pivotal Supreme Court ruling effectively shifted the balance towards legislative deference. Meaning, if lawmakers say something is necessary for supporting government operations, the court will usually take their word for it. And that created what critics call the support loophole. Because under that interpretation, almost any revenue-generating bill can potentially qualify. If it raises money for government, it supports government. And if it supports government, it can be shielded from referendum. That is why opponents call this a blank check, not because taxes exist, but because the mechanism increasingly limits voters' ability to directly challenge them. The business climate warning. While the legal fight escalates, a separate warning sign is flashing red across the state economy. A new survey from the Association of Washington Business paints a troubling picture. 1 in 4 businesses are considering leaving Washington. 55% considering moving personal residence. 18% already developing relocation plans. 44% consulting tax professionals. In Spokane County, 67% are looking towards Idaho. That Spokane number should terrify Olympia because Idaho isn't just another state, it's right there. Lower taxes, lower regulatory burden, lower housing costs in many areas. When businesses can relocate a short drive across the border while dramatically reducing tax exposure, that becomes a very real pressure point. And according to the survey, this isn't just billionaires complaining on CNBC. A major concern involves pass-through businesses. These are often small and medium-sized companies where business income flows directly onto the owner's personal tax return. Meaning the millionaire tax doesn't just hit hedge fund managers, it can hit growing local businesses, reinvesting profits into expansion, payroll, hiring, or equipment. Katie Wilson's buy comment. Into that environment stepped Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson. During a Seattle University event on April 14th, Wilson dismissed concerns about wealthy residents leaving Washington over taxes.
I think the claims that millionaires are going to leave our state are like super overblown, and if the ones that leave, like bye.
That's the mayor. Now, politically, that line probably played well in the room, but economically, that's a very different calculation, because critics immediately pointed to the broader trend lines already developing across the region. Seattle already has one of the highest combined sales tax rates in America, at over 10%. Office vacancy remains a major issue. Commercial real estate is struggling. And companies like Starbucks have already shifted major operations elsewhere, including thousands of jobs headed toward Nashville. Now, to be fair, corporations move for lots of reasons. But taxes are not the only factor. But dismissing relocation concerns entirely while your own statewide business survey shows 1 in 4 employers considering leaving is ambitious. That's one word for it. Another word would be gambling. The bigger question. Here's the larger issue tonight. This story is not just about one tax. It's about whether Washington's political leadership believes there is any practical limit to taxation, regulation, or economic pressure before businesses and residents finally decide the math no longer works. because every state competes now. Workers compete, cities compete, businesses compete, and mobility matters, especially in a post-pandemic world where high earners and companies increasingly have options. Washington built enormous economic strength over the last several decades through innovation, aerospace, logistics, agriculture, and tech expansion. But prosperity is not automatic, and history is full of regions that assumed economic success would simply continue forever, right up until it didn't. The Washington Supreme Court may have settled the referendum fight for now, but they did not settle the political fight or the economic one, because voters are still asking whether Olympia is listening. Businesses are still asking whether Washington remains competitive. And lawmakers are still betting that taxpayers, employers, and investors will keep absorbing higher costs without eventually changing their behavior. This is the gamble now underway in Washington state. And the consequences of that bet won't just affect millionaires. They'll affect jobs, investment, housing, local tax revenue, and the long-term economic direction of the entire Pacific Northwest. We'll keep tracking it. Thank you for watching Left Coast News. Please like, share, and follow us if you got anything out of this story. You can find us on Rumble, Brighteon, BitChute, Spotify, X, Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social, TikTok, and Patreon. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because independent media only grows when people are willing to speak up and share their stories. I want to know what you think of these court rulings and Mayor Wilson's response and our state government's response to how businesses are responding to these taxes. Do you think it's right? Do you think it matters? Or do you think ultimately things will even out on their own? It's a strange system we built, really. The people paying the taxes have to beg for permission to vote on the taxes. Thanks for watching.